The Milwaukee Bucks might be the most important team to watch for at the 2025 NBA trade deadline. I'm going to break down why in today's video, as well as give my predictions for what I ultimately think the Milwaukee Bucks are going to be, first of all, forced to do, and then second of all, will want to do in result of what they first do. I think this is going to be a very fun video if you're a Bucks fan. Let me know down in the comment section below, how long have you been a Milwaukee Bucks fan for? I'm sure some of you are brand new fans in the Giannis era. I'm sure some of you maybe even go back to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Oscar Robertson days. And I'm sure there's plenty in between with Brandon Jennings, Michael Redd, and a lot of other fun Milwaukee Bucks basketball players in the middle of that tenure as well. So let me know in the comment section below. I'm going to be leaving little hearts on all of those. And let's talk about the Milwaukee Bucks today in this video preview. First of all, we're going to cover 3 predictions for the Milwaukee Bucks ahead of the 2025 NBA trade deadline. Now, these predictions are all, for the most part, goal-oriented, whether that be trying to improve the Milwaukee Bucks or overcoming some of the new trade restrictions that actually limit the Milwaukee Bucks right now and their potential to get a deal done in a kind of move. There's going to be a lot of different discussion, and I also want to give a reminder here. This reminder is super important. If you want to hear everything that's going on during the week of the NBA trade deadline, and if you're at work or you're not able to just sit there glued to your phone screen the entire time, what I recommend, bring an earbud so you can tune into the channel. I'll be live the entire week of the NBA trade deadline, covering all the news, covering everything Shams Charania reports, and all of the other news from mainstream media. This is going to be the best place for you to be. So be sure you leave a like on today's video if you enjoy, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on those future uploads and live streams. And let's jump into it here now with prediction number 1. I don't want to waste any more time. My first prediction, the Milwaukee Bucks salary dump Pat Connaughton. Pat Connaughton makes $9.424 million this season, as well as next year with a player option. Now you might be saying, okay, well, why would Milwaukee want to salary dump Pat Connaughton? This answer is multifold. Right now, the Milwaukee Bucks are a second apron team. One of the short-term benefits of salary dumping Pat Connaughton somewhere would be getting off of his money and being able to actually dip below the second apron. Right now, the Bucks are $6.5 million above the second apron number. So if you trade out Pat Connaughton's money into either cap space or into a trade exception, you could get out of his money completely, duck below the second apron, and that opens up a lot of trade flexibility for you by being a first apron team instead of a second apron team. If they trade Pat Connaughton to cap space or into one of those trade exceptions like I mentioned, they will now be able to aggregate salaries, which means they could combine 2 salaries together in a trade, something that presently, as constituted with Pat Connaughton on the roster and his salary on their books, they cannot do that right now. So that would open up a ton of trade flexibility, and it would allow them to target different players, different kinds of contracts around the league. And I think that's something that Milwaukee will very much look to do this trade deadline. And then secondly, one of the other benefits, if you get out of the second apron right now this season, it also does not mean your 2032 first round pick will be frozen. And by frozen, what I mean by that is not trade eligible. One of the long-term fallouts of being a second apron team is the loss of tradable access to your far out future picks that are not tradable presently. So for Milwaukee, if you stay in the second apron, you will not be able to trade your 2032 first round pick once it becomes available to you. Whereas the other teams in the NBA, the other 26 that are not in the second apron, have the ability to trade that asset. So not only does the second apron hurt your current trade flexibility, it will severely hinder the future trade flexibility for franchises as well. So this is, again, a twofold issue here for Milwaukee. If they keep Pat Connaughton, they really lose an opportunity to get below the second apron, find ways to improve their team both now and keep their flexibility open for the future, whether that be post Giannis or trying to use that 2032 pick in some other kind of way in the future to help out Giannis there in Milwaukee. And here are some potential trade partners, and I really wanted to cover this because I think this is a very important discussion for Milwaukee. Detroit is the one that makes the most sense on paper. They have legitimate cap space. They're the only team out of all 30 in the NBA that has real, meaningful, useful cap space. They could flat out absorb Pat Connaughton's salary. Now, with that in mind, there are some complications here. Like, Detroit would want something in return for eating Pat Connaughton's contract. Otherwise, Detroit might just use this cap space to try and improve their team, which is ultimately what I expect to happen. So The Bucks don't have a ton of assets to add into deals. I don't think the Pistons would want to do it for just 1 or 2 second-round picks, given the fact that Connaughton has money on the books for next year as well. Now, the Bucks are also not going to be willing to give up a 2031 first-rounder to just get off of Pat Connaughton, so I don't think that's going to happen. So then we have to start canvassing the league, looking for other teams that make sense, and I wanted to really focus on a bunch of Eastern Conference teams because I think the seeding from 15 up to about 9 or 8 even in some cases all make sense as possible Connaughton landing spots for a few different reasons. The Atlanta Hawks have a $25.266 million trade exception from trading DeJounte Murray in the offseason, but there are some complications here. They are only $5.35 million away from the first apron, and they would be a tax team if they acquired Pat Connaughton. So the Hawks don't really make a ton of sense in that regard, because if they're going to use some of that trade exception, eat all of Pat Connaughton's contract, well, the downside here is they go into the first apron. They also would become a tax team, and I just don't think that's on Atlanta's bingo card for the 2025 season. The Bulls kind of in a similar situation, but a little bit different for a few reasons. First of all, the Bulls have a $17.5 million trade exception from the DeMar DeRozan sign and trade in the offseason. This is a little bit different because they have $9.52 million in first apron space. And if you look at Connaughton's contract, again, $9.424 million, you can look at that as a very clean, easy fit, where Connaughton could slide into the Chicago Bulls cap sheet without pushing them over into the first apron, which sounds all good and dandy. The issue, though, again, remains with the actual tax line. I think a lot of the coverage, a lot of our analysis here at Utility Sports especially has focused on these new tax aprons and how these things are problematic for teams. The issue is we just have to remember the tax line is still a big deal as well. The Bulls will not want to enter the tax by eating Pat Connaughton's contract. So this is where things become very difficult and complicated, and for that reason, I don't see the Bulls as a very likely landing spot for Pat Connaughton overall. The Brooklyn Nets, again, kind of in that same boat. They have the trade exception. They don't really have the first apron space, so this is, again, very comparable to Atlanta, and they would be in the tax. And Brooklyn does not want to be in the tax with the team that they're trying to lose games with intentionally right now. The Nets are also looking for expiring contracts. Pat Connaughton does not fit that mold either, so I think you can cross off the Hawks, you can cross off the Bulls, you can cross off the Nets right now. They are not realistic trade destinations for Pat Connaughton in my estimation. This is the team that really makes sense. The Washington Wizards. They have a $12.4 million trade exception that will be expiring. That is from the Daniel Gafford trade with Dallas last trade deadline. They have $12.146 million in first apron space. And acquiring Pat Connaughton would not push the Washington Wizards into the tax. Now, Washington might have some other trades. They might move Valanciunas. They might move Kuzma. They might look to move Brogdon. There are a few players that I think Washington would have significant interest in trading to other contending teams possibly. But I think the Wizards, at this point in their rebuild, they're in asset accumulation mode. Getting 2 second-round picks for Pat Connaughton would be right up the Wizards' alley. They would be very willing to talk shop here with the Milwaukee Bucks. So ultimately, not only do I predict that the Milwaukee Bucks salary dump Pat Connaughton, I think that they will trade him to the Washington Wizards in a deal where picks, just small second-round assets, and Connaughton's contract goes to Washington in return for almost nothing. The Pelicans are already in the tax for the same reasons that I talked about with the Hawks, Bulls, and Nets. I think you can cross New Orleans off the list. I think Washington is ultimately the landing spot for Pat Connaughton. The Bucks dip below the second apron, and it opens up the possibility to do what I predict here in prediction number 2, which is to make an aggregated trade where they include 2 or more salaries together in one deal. And those 2 salaries I think they're going to heavily include in trade talks are both Khris Middleton and Bobby Portis in one deal together. Khris Middleton making a little bit over $30 million. He is just a shell of himself at this point in time. 2 of his last 3 games, he has played over 15 minutes and has recorded 0 points in both games. He played 19 minutes the other night, did not score, and then last night played 15 minutes, did not score. Khris Middleton has not been the normal self that obviously Bucks fans saw en route to an NBA championship in 2021. Of course, injuries are what have ultimately propelled that, and it's unfortunate. Khris Middleton was one of my favorite players to watch in the league for a long time. I really enjoyed the way that he gets buckets. I think a lot of people would call him an ethical hooper. He's a really talented player, and he has been. You think about some of his marquee playoff performances. He seems like he always goes off against the Boston Celtics. It's unfortunate for Milwaukee Bucks fans because I think Khris Middleton was very well liked and respected there, but at this point in time, with Milwaukee having championship aspirations around Giannis Antetokounmpo and Damian Lillard, Khris Middleton at this point in time is not a positive contributor at his salary for that kind of aspiration. Khris Middleton needs to get moved. Bobby Portis is an okay, solid player, has some defensive deficiencies for sure, can score the basketball, but I think these two salaries together is what will open up a lot of trade flexibility, a lot of trade room for the Bucks to work with. You get close to $45 million with these two in a package. They have other smaller salaries that they could theoretically include as well. Now, it's important to note, if they do aggregate salaries together, they will be hard capped at the second apron, so they cannot re-enter the second apron again. That's a very important note to remember. So if they salary dump Pat Connaughton, they can aggregate salaries, but the moment they aggregate salaries, they cannot go back into the second apron. And remember the first apron rule, they cannot take in more salary than they trade out in a trade. So there's a lot of little nuances and caveats here that will be super important to remember regarding the Milwaukee Bucks and the trades that they can theoretically look to make. But they're in position to strike, and they're in position to strike for something very, very big. And that something very big is going to happen this year. It is either going to be Zach LaVine or Bradley Beal. And now, Bucks fans, listen to me here. This is a prediction on what I think will happen. I think trading for Bradley Beal in the year 2025 would be a horrendous mistake. Something I would really not want the Milwaukee Bucks to do. But again, this is me predicting. This is not me in the GM chair deciding what to do. If I were the Bucks, I would stay as far away as possible from Bradley Beal. His contract is horrid. His production isn't good for his contract size and value and term. Zach LaVine on a very similar size contract in terms of length, and he has a trade kicker, which would come into play here as well and elevate his contract up closer to Bradley Beal's number. So that's an important caveat to remember as well when it comes to contracts here. But Zach LaVine has been having a tremendous season for the Chicago Bulls. He has been a star as an off-ball player. He is a star when the ball is in his hands. And I think if you're looking for a player to play third fiddle next to Damian Lillard and next to Giannis Antetokounmpo, and if you're looking for a player to actually step up and be for this team what the hope Khris Middleton would be for them, Zach LaVine is that guy. He is athletic. He gets up and down the court extremely well. Obviously, I think his overall athletic profile would be a huge burst to Milwaukee around Andre Jackson Jr. and Giannis Antetokounmpo. There's just not a ton of athleticism on this roster holistically. So I think someone like Zach LaVine, who has good downhill speed, of course, multiple-time slam dunk champion. We know he gets off the ground well. He has dealt with injuries in his career, but when he's been healthy, he's been an extremely productive player. I think for the better part of the last 4 or 5 years, people have really been conflating the difference between his value and his contract size. He's not probably worth his contract, but he's a really darn good basketball player. And for a team like Milwaukee, who is really strapped in assets, they only have their 2031 first-round pick as a tradable first-round pick to trade. They don't have a ton of second-round picks. They don't have a ton of young, exciting young players that they could throw into deals. They don't have a bunch of good NBA veterans right now that teams are oohing and eyeing over. Like Khris Middleton is not an attractive asset. Bobby Portis is not the most attractive asset available at this trade deadline. The Bucks don't have a ton of flexibility. They're going to go into a trade here, a multi-team trade, part of the Jimmy Butler sweepstakes, where Jimmy Butler maybe goes to Phoenix or Golden State, and then Zach LaVine finds his way from Chicago to Milwaukee. The Bucks would probably send their 2031 first-round pick to Chicago in that deal. Again, there is great risk in that. The Bucks do have some long-term risk that is super important. You look at the assets that they owe to Portland from the Damian Lillard trade. They are very, very thin on draft capital yet at this point in time, and sending out a 2031 first, maybe even unprotected, would be another huge gamble, but I think it's a gamble that would be at least calculated and could make the Bucks a significant threat in the Eastern Conference, with Brook Lopez being still your big-time paint protector. He's had a good resurgent year this year after the season he had last season, and I think if you look at Zach LaVine, the way he's performed this year in an off-ball role with increased pace there in Chicago, around Josh Giddey, around some of the other guards, Kobe White, I would assume new. I think there's a lot to like about Zach LaVine and his potential theoretical fit in Milwaukee. I think he's the type of player that could change this Bucks season and push them a little bit closer into serious, true title contention. When you have Giannis Antetokounmpo, you have a chance in any playoff series. We've seen that in years past. He's been the uplifter and elevator of the Bucks for a long time, and I think with Zach LaVine and Damian Lillard, you have the perimeter shot-making talent, you have the floor spacing, and a little bit more athleticism with LaVine being added in over Khris Middleton, that the Bucks could seriously be looked at as a real risk to come out of the East. Now, it's not going to be easy. The Cavaliers are awesome. The Celtics are very, very good once again. They've been in a little bit of a rough patch as of late, but I think Milwaukee specifically, as of right now, I don't view them as a true title contender with Khris Middleton being quote-unquote their third best player and relying on Andre Jackson come playoff time a lot. Like, there's just some real risks with the way that this team is built. And I think if you do trade for Zach LaVine, while it does increase your long-term risk and your insurance policy gets even deeper in a way, you also improve your team drastically right now. And I think that's what the Bucks will ultimately look to do at the 2025 NBA trade deadline. So let's get to a bonus prediction as well. Part of this, I think the Milwaukee Bucks will dump MarJon Beauchamp at the trade deadline. MarJon Beauchamp had his team option decline before the season, and he's a smaller contract. He's a younger player. I think the Bucks will utilize him in trade talks as well. Could be part of the Zach LaVine trade. Could be a part of some other kind of trade out there as well. The Bucks are going to aggressively look to find ways to make trades happen and get a deal done somewhere. Pat Connaughton's going to get moved. Khris Middleton, Bobby Portis very likely can get moved, and MarJon Beauchamp could get moved. What we're going to see is a massive overhaul of this roster at the trade deadline. I'm thinking 4 or 5 players possibly getting traded. That's a third of your roster in the NBA. So that's a significant shift in the roster composition. It's a significant shift in the team. And listen, the Bucks have been pretty good as of late. Since the beginning of the new year, they've been winning pretty well. Even going back into December, they have really kind of found themselves in a way that I think there's a legitimate hope here for the Bucks going into the playoffs, that they can be a competitive team and push some of these other Eastern Conference foes. But for them to improve and really upscale their roster, I think they have to be aggressive this trade deadline. When you have Giannis Antetokounmpo on your roster, the clock is ticking, and the Bucks, after 2 consecutive first-round exits in back-to-back playoffs, I just cannot see them going into this postseason and possibly risking that happening for a third consecutive time. I know the conversation, the chatter around Giannis Antetokounmpo and his long-term trade flexibility, and is he going to get dealt at some point? Will he ask out? I know Bucks fans are tired of that question, but I think it's a very valid question. If you lose in the first round 3 consecutive years with arguably the best or second best player in the world on your roster, that's a very big concern long-term for Milwaukee. And I think they're going to try and push their chips in, do what they can to show Giannis, first of all, this is where you want to be. We can win here. We just need you, LaVine, and Damian Lillard to be healthy at the right time if they land LaVine. That's the kind of situation I could see Giannis being okay with, sticking in and staying there for the long haul still with Milwaukee moving forward. MarJon Beauchamp's going to get salary dumped in the process here, be a part of some other deal, whether it be the LaVine trade or maybe the Pat Connaughton trade in some way. Obviously, that would be difficult because of the aggregation rules, so there'd have to be other moving pieces in that. But I think it's a real possibility here and something that I could see coming to fruition at the trade deadline. Ultimately, 4 predictions in today's video. I really hope you guys did enjoy. If you did, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe for more NBA content. Remember, we're going to be live on the channel the entire week of the NBA trade deadline, so this is the place you're going to want to be. Comment down below right now what you think the Milwaukee Bucks will do, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.